Hello, Magic players and collectors. Welcome back to the Land Library. I'm your librarian, and in this episode of Legendary Locations, we're returning to Ixalan to talk about the Spitfire Bastion. Or, well, that's the name of the video at least, because like usual, I'll be covering the region as a whole, which is the Stormwreck Sea. This is a, well, sea with an archipelago off the northeast of the main continent of Ixalan that has been claimed by a group of pirates called the Brazen Coalition. And before getting any further, I'm gonna say I'm switching around the structure of legendary locations a little. Explaining the cards after the lore, like I do in local landmarks, makes way more sense, and I've been doing it the other way around for legendary locations. So I'm gonna starting with lore from now on. The history of the Stormwreck Sea is actually quite short compared to a lot of the rest of the plane. It only really starts at around 4460 AR, which is about 100 years back from the current point on the timeline. Technically, the sea and archipelago have existed for long before that, but it was just, an empty sea with some islands. But in 4460 AR, when the Legion of Dusk was conquering Torrazon, many people of the western coast, the last area to be conquered, fled the continent. Obviously, they went west to the much larger continent of Ixalan, but were not welcomed by the Sun Empire. Being unable to enter Ixalan and unable to return to Torrazon, these ships and people were left with limited resources and limited options, resorting to piracy to survive. They raided cities on the coast and each other's ships. Several captains started making a name for themselves by being the best pirates, and the biggest name of them was Beckett Brass, captain of the Scourge. However, there was an incident when the Scourge ran into another ship, the Squid Eye. The crews fought each other for a while, but it became apparent that the ships were too tangled to actually separate, and the two captains decided to instead make the ships the beginning of a floating pirate neutral ground called High and Dry. Over time, High and Dry grew, with more damaged ships being brought in, and the floating city began to thrive with shipwrights, blacksmiths, and trainers. With a haven to stock up, get repairs, and train new crew, the pirates truly prospered, forming the Brazen Coalition, and many captains started claiming islands in the Stormwreck Sea as their home bases, including very notable captain Ripley Vance, who built the Spitfire Bastion. Captain Vance was a pyro-mage pirate who made a name for herself by being a bit obsessed with cannons. She would fight basically anyone and would claim the cannons of every ship she defeated, but as her collection grew, it became literally too heavy for her ship, and she had to settle down somewhere. She found an island with a constant lava flow and blasted it with a barrage of cannons to carve out a base. This was the Spitfire Bastion, and coincidentally, it was built on an island at approximately the halfway mark between the Ixalan coast and High and Dry, becoming an important stop for many pirates to resupply, and thus became the second biggest coalition base, only behind High and Dry. But pirates still needed to stay in Vance's good graces to not be bombarded by the full armory, and with all sides and approaches heavily equipped, unauthorized ships didn't stand a chance. During the same rise of pirate prosperity, they were able to establish a port on Ixalan's coast called Sunray Bay. As the foothold of the coalition on continental land, this was the primary source of supplies and people, including other races than just the original humans from Torrazon. Orcs, goblins, sirens, and even a few merfolk joined up with the coalition. As the coalition kept growing, they even became bold enough to start hitting the coast of Torrazon with raids, but then something happened that shook up the whole plane: the new Phyrexian invasion. The Phyrexians devastated a lot of the plane. However, the coalition wasn't really hit that hard. Turns out a society based around constant conflict where individuals are armed to the teeth at all times does a pretty good job of defending themselves. But due to how well defended the coalition was, many refugees actually sought them out and went to High and Dry to seek their protection. Admiral Brass was away on an expedition, and the left behind pirates were quite disinterested in helping anyone but their own, so just abandoned the floating city. In their absence, the Phyrexians turned a lot of the refugees into Phyrexians. However, Brass was already returning, having cut the expedition short when she saw Realmbreaker tearing the sky. Brass and her fleet made quick work of the Phyrexians in High and Dry, and truly cemented her position as the leader of the city and coalition, but was also now a hero of the refugees. This newfound herodom caused Brass to have a change of heart and led the coalition to stop pirating. In an attempt to become a legitimate nation, the coalition worked hard to pay back debts, right previous wrongs, and return stolen goods. Because of the devastation by the Phyrexians, the coast of Ixalan was quite empty, and the forgotten caves to the core were rediscovered, leading the coalition to make mining and trade their new main source of commerce as they spread out across the coast. They also started their own navy called the Bluecoats to keep order. Now that the coalition was a peaceful mining society, Vance was repositioned away from all her cannons and made the mayor of Sunray Bay, and the Spitfire Bastion was converted into a mining operation that eventually dug into Tecaltlan. This was the coalition's main way in and out of the core. However, they had much less interest in the core than a lot of the other factions of the plane did, and mostly just mined the tunnels for Cosmium. Unfortunately, over at the big mine of the Sunray Bay, they dug a little too deep and encountered the Mycoids, who quickly corrupted the city, and it was abandoned. Malcolm Lee and Breaches were sent to investigate, finding the empty city and Mycoids in it. Fighting off the Mycoids, they got deeper and deeper into the mines, finding themselves face to face with the Myco Tyrant himself, and Breaches kinda just blew him up. They then returned to High and Dry to report, but Vance's fate was never really discovered, so she is considered missing, but not necessarily dead. And that is currently where the lore ends. Onto the cards, there are two legendary lands this time around: Spitfire Bastion, transforming from Vance's blasting cannons, and Tecaltlan the Searing Rift, transforming from Brass's Tunnel Grinder. Vance's Blasting Cannons is an enchantment with a casting cost of 3 generic and a red that exiles the top card of your library at the beginning of your upkeep each turn, and if it's not a land, you can cast it from exile that turn. Then, if you cast 3 spells in a single turn, you can transform it into Spitfire Bastion, which simply taps for a red, or for 2 generic and a red, it taps to do 3 damage to any single target creature or player. And Brass's Tunnel Grinder is an artifact with a casting cost of 2 generic and a red that when it enters has you discard any number of cards, then draw that many +1. Then, at your end step, if you descended that turn, it gets a boar counter, and once it hits 3 counters, they are removed and it's transformed into Tecaltlan the Searing Rift. This is a cave that taps for red mana, but whenever that mana is used to cast a permanent, you discover equal to the mana cost of that permanent. And in case you don't know what those keywords mean, descending happens anytime a permanent is put into your graveyard at all from anywhere. And discovering works by exiling the top card of your library until you find a card with a casting cost equal to or less than the discover number, and either cast it without paying its cost or put it in your hand, then return the rest of the cards to the bottom of your library in a random order. Now for some creatures, there's over 100 Ixalan pirate cards, and there's no way I'm gonna name all of those, so I'll just stick to the more notable Brazen Coalition members, like Admiral Brass, very obviously was very notable, and has 2 different cards. Then we've got Captain Ripley Vance, Captain Lannery Storm, who I didn't really mention in the lore, but was still a pretty notable captain. Breaches, who has 2 cards, Malcolm, who also has 2 cards, and Captain Vargas Wrath, who also didn't really get mentioned in lore, but is an orc captain. That's cool. Also, the Myco Tyrant is probably pretty relevant here, even though it's not really a pirate or in this region, still feels worth bringing up. For spells, we've got Admiral's Order, Brass's Bounty, Chart a Course, Contract Killing, Evacuation, Fire Cannon Blast, Fiery Cannonade, Gamble, Hornswoggle, Mutiny, Skullduggery, Tectonic Hazard, and Unfriendly Fire. Then for enchantments, there's Brazen Cannonade, Makeshift Munitions, Navigator's Ruin, Sea Legs, and Swashbuckling. For artifacts, Captain's Hook, Careering Minecart, Dowsing Device, Elaborate Fire Cannon, Pirate Hat, Pirate Cutlass, Shadowed Caravel, Sleek Schooner, the Belligerent, and the Indomitable. As for lands, we've got Geode Grotto and Promising Vein for definite lands in the region, Glacial Fortress, Cinder Barrens, Drowned Catacomb, Unknown Shores, and a Secret Lair Watery Grave for arts that do belong to the region but are not native land cards, and then Hidden Volcano and Restless Anchorage as maybes. I can't quite place either, but they seem like they're probably in the Stormwreck Sea. Like, Hidden Volcano is probably connected to Decathlon, and Restless Anchorage is definitely in the sea somewhere, but I don't know which sea. There's also a playtest phenomenon card for High and Dry called High and Dry Black Market. And if you don't know what phenomenon cards are, they go in the planar deck with plane cards and act as basically an event instead of an actual plane to visit. That's a total of 11 creatures, 13 spells, 6 enchantments, 11 artifacts, 4 lands, plus 5 arts, 2 maybes, and the playtest phenomenon. Although the legendary lands are double-sided, so there's an overlap of 2, for a grand total of 43 cards, or 51 if you include all the extras. Or, I guess, like 150-ish if you want to include every single pirate. We've got 2 legendaries to discuss, both of which are transforming lands, starting with the namesake of the video, Spitfire Bastion. Both sides are kind of mediocre in general, but solid options in their specific niches. The enchantment just adds an impulse draw for free, basically, every turn, which definitely can be useful in the right deck. Decks that already like impulse draws, just want things in exile, or care about like casting from exile, can really benefit from the free impulse draws every turn. It also just generally helps draw through more of your deck in formats like Commander that have very large decks, and the option of whether or not to transform is pretty nice. It's one of the best options in my mind for impulse draws or playing from exile niche, but it's not exactly the most widely played niche. People aren't lining up to play Quintorius Can. And the land side is just make mana or do damage. Only 3 single target damage at that. There are much cheaper, even repeatable ways to get 3 single target damage, but it's not like it's super expensive, like overpriced in mana, so it's a pretty okay option for damage heavy decks, especially since it's not that hard to transform in like burn spell focused decks, because you can play a bunch of spells and transform it easily. And it's also a nice backup option in said deck where you already have used up your hand on a bunch of cheap burn spells, and now you still have a damage source to spend your mana on. But due to how niche this card is, it only sees play in like 5,000 decks on EDA track, which is pretty decent, but it's only like a 0.13% usage. Brass's Tunnel Grinder, on the other hand, is pretty good just generally, and sees like 17 times that much play. Specifically, it sees 2.29% usage, which is really solid. It's also currently in Standard, where it has even seen some meta level play. Resetting your hand, but with an extra card, is very powerful, and it can just get you a new hand, or it can help stack your graveyard. But it doesn't really do anything else while it's an artifact. Then, as a land, it gives you free discovers, playing cards for free or stocking up your hand just from using the mana it produces, which is very helpful. It can comfortably go in any deck, really, that includes red, as opposed to the niche decks that the other one goes into. It also even has the cave subtype if you're playing with cards that care about caves. Its only big drawback is how slow it transforms. One counter per turn if you descend can be tricky. Descending isn't really that hard. All you need to do is like sacrifice something or discard something, and you could also potentially proliferate extra counters if it's in a proliferate deck. But without the right support from the rest of the deck, it can definitely get stuck for several turns as a dormant artifact. And as an artifact, it's a little more vulnerable because artifact destruction is relatively common, especially compared to land destruction. Even with this big drawback, it sees pretty heavy play, and is a pretty solid option. Spitfire Bastion as an actual card is maybe around like C tier for usability. It has a niche and is pretty good in that niche, but isn't widely helpful, which is kind of C tier. However, it has super interesting and important lore, which makes it feel way more legendary, and it has to at least bump it up to a B. So I put it in like a high B. I don't think it goes all the way up to A. Chicotlin is basically the opposite, being a solid, like, high B usage card, but it's barely acknowledged in the lore. Like, it exists, but the entirety of its lore is kind of just, they dig into it, and then it's there, which it's gotta drag it down to maybe like a high C. If you've made it this far in the video, please drop a like for Turn, and subscribe for more Landfield content. If I missed anything, got anything wrong, or you just have questions, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next Legendary locations with another visit to Dominaria.